Okay, continuing on. I look like a fucking maniac. I don't know, man. This coat is a lot. Um, I wore it out to a kind of fancy restaurant, and I had the sunglasses on because I was going to brunch. And I walked by, and somebody at the restaurant was like, "Who is that?" And I was like, "Holy shit!" Like people think I'm a famous person just because I have a gold coat on, but like it's pretty cool. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So Clint Brooks says, if we allow ourselves to be misled by the heresy of paraphrase, meaning if we spend all our time talking about the summary of the art instead of the art itself, we run the risk of doing more violence to the internal order of the poem itself, right? You're really kind of fucking with the poem. You're not looking at it. By taking the paraphrase as our point of stance, I mean, the point of departure, like where we get started, if you get started with the paraphrase, we misconceive the function of motive and meter. Meter is rhythm in a poem. We demand logical coherences where they are sometimes irrelevant, and we fail frequently to see imaginative coherences on relevance on areas where they're highly relevant. So, it's like if you're not talking about a movie, but you're rather talking about a summary of a movie, you're really screwing everything up. You're missing everything the poem is doing because its ideas are intimately connected to the individual word choices that are being made. Another classic example of this, by the way, is if your favorite movie, let's say your favorite movie is John Wick 3, and you tell your friend, "Oh man, John Wick 3 was fucking badass. You got to see this goddamn movie." And the person says, "Okay, all right, that's your favorite movie. I'm going to watch it. I want to see what's going on, buddy." And then they come back and they go, "Yeah, man, I read a whole summary on Wikipedia about it. It seemed really cool." And you go, "Well, what? You didn't see the movie?" And they said, "Yeah, I read a summary of it. I know what it's about." But like, no one's going to, I know this is crazy. No one's going to see John Wick for what it's about. I don't care what it's about. I don't really care what happens. I'm going to see John Wick because the fight choreography is fucking awesome. And also, I like watching Keanu Reeves do shit. I just enjoy that guy. And there's cool shit. There's cool cars. There's cool buildings. None of that is in the summary. They'll be like, "Oh yeah, he got in a fight and he punched this guy a couple of times and then he beat him and he killed him and he won." But that captures nothing about what makes that movie great. You have to watch the individual kicks and punches to actually appreciate what's going on. Same thing with ballet. A summary of ballet is stupid. A swan is another swan. Who gives a shit? You're there to see the human body move. A summary of a sports event. Like, if you want, why does anybody watch sports? Why don't they just wait till it's over and find out what the score was? Because you want to see the people do the individual movements. You don't want a summary. And for Clint Brooks, a lot of people are throwing the poem away to talk about summary. And the key thing he's worried they're doing is because of Wordsworth, they're throwing the poem away. And instead of talking about the poem, they're talking about the life of the author. Because Wordsworth told him that's what really matters in art is the author's emotions expressed. And so they're throwing the poem away and they're talking about the emotions of the author. Um, okay. He says, but what would be a more positive theory? So if we're not going to do that, what are we? If we're not going to paraphrase the poem, what are we going to do? We tend to embrace the doctrine of a logical structure the more readily because to many of us, the failure to do so seems to leave the meaning of the poem hopelessly up in the air, right? It's got to make sense. You have to be able to paraphrase it. Otherwise, what the fuck does that mean? The alternative position will appear to us to lack even the relative stability of an ivory tower. I'm not talking about that. It's rather a commitment to a free balloon. I'm not talking about that either. For to deny the possibility, here we go. For to deny the possibility of pinning down what the poem says to some statement will seem to assert the poem really says nothing. And to point out what has been suggested in earlier chapters and brought to a head in this one, namely, one can never measure a poem up against a scientific or philosophical yardstick, for the reason that the poem, when laid along the yardstick, is never the full poem, but an abstraction from the poem, meaning you took the ideas out of the poem. And such an argument will seem to readers to be a piece of barren logic chopping, a transparent dodge. I'm not going to talk about this very much. I don't think it's super important. His point is it's just a different way of saying the same thing he's been saying, which is that when you use philosophy to decide if a poem is good or bad, when you use history to decide if a poem is good or bad, when you use an author's life to decide if a poem is good or bad, um, you're not really using the poem. You're generally using a summary of the poem because what you're talking about is the events that have happened to the characters and not the actual poem. All right, I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over again 8 or 9 times, so let's just get through this a little faster and start going here. Considerations of strategy, then, if nothing more, dictate some positive account of what a poem is and does. And some positive account can be given, though I cannot promise to do more than suggest what a poem is, nor will my terms turn out to be anything more than metaphors. Okay, so he's going to kind of try to give you, he says, well, because this is a good question, right? It's if he's saying, stop talking about what the poem is about and talk about the poem, what the hell does he mean? So he tries to kind of explain what he means. I'm going to also give you guys an example of that. Before I do, actually, I'm going to go a little farther. I'm going to make sure I talk about something else in the next video. Okay. Um, the essential structure of a poem, as distinguished from the rational or logical structure of the statement which we abstract from it, right? That people, it's not about the statement the poem is making, but if you're actually talking about the poem, it resembles that of architecture or painting. It's a pattern of resolved stress. Or to be more closer to poetry by considering the temporal arts, the structure of a poem resembles that of a ballet or musical composition. It's a pattern of resolutions and balances and harmonizations developed through a temporal scheme. So this point is, you got to talk about the way the words relate to the other words. If you're talking about a poem or a play, you got to talk about the way one image relates to another image, right? That's the essence of it is you want to talk about what the poem, how it actually works. You got to describe how the parts to relate to each other. And he can, so and you can see it's more this point here that's like music again. Think symphony music, ballet, and he actually says architecture. Think about that for a second. Do you see how there's no way, like architecture is an art form where you make these huge buildings that are these gorgeous works of art? How do you summarize a beautiful building? You can't. You got to go look at it and walk around in it. Um, and I'd already made the ballet John Wick comparison, but like the architecture one, if there's a beautiful build like this, like something, what's a really cool building in New York? I should be able to think of one quickly, and I can't. I wish I had you here. I miss all of you guys. Oh, the Oculus, right near BMCC. That's a neat piece of architecture, but you don't summarize it. You just gotta go walk around and live with it, notice how it's put together, and talk about the way it's built. You don't summarize it and then talk about the summary. How could you even do that? And Clint Brooks's point is that's exactly what you do with the poem. You got to talk about how it actually works and what's actually going on the page. Okay. He says the general point is not that either poetry or drama makes not use of ideas, or that it's merely emotional, whatever that is, but that there is not in the closest and most important relationship between the intellectual materials which they absorb into their structure and other elements in the structure. The relationship between the intellectual and non-intellectual elements in a poem is actually far more intimate than conventional accounts won't represent it to be. The relationship is not that of an idea wrapped in emotion or a prose sense decorated by sensuous imagery. So it sounds like he makes this a really important point. He says, it sounds like I'm saying the ideas don't matter. He says, but they do matter. It's just that they're so closely connected to the individual artistic choices that to change the poem into a summary and then talk about the summary, to reduce the poem to history and then talk about the history, to reduce the poem to biography and talk about biography, is to destroy the ideas in the process, because the ideas can't be separated from the individual words used to express them. And this is why I'm not interested in Shakespeare when it doesn't have Shakespeare's actual language, because I think they've basically taken the plot of the story and retold it. That's not interesting to me. What's interesting to me is the way the actual words work on the page. Okay, cool. So he says, but the reader may well ask, is it not possible to frame a proposition, a statement, which will adequately represent the total meaning of the poem? Right? There should be a way to paraphrase it correctly. Is it not possible to elaborate a summarizing proposition which will say, briefly and in the form of a proposition, what the poem says as a poem? A proposition which will say it fully and will say it exactly, no more and no less? Could not the poet, if he had chosen, frame such a proposition? Cannot we in readers frame such a proposition? So now he's answering the question of, wait a minute, there should be some way to correctly paraphrase it. There should be some, because what we're doing in literature is often we're saying, let me tell you what the thing is about. So there must be a way to like tell you what it's about in huge detail that would equal the poem itself. Right? There's got to be a way to do that. And Clint Brooks says, no, there really isn't. You have to talk about what the words and the images are actually doing in their specific form. You can't throw the form away. There's no way to accurately sort of translate it into other terms. Okay, in the next video, I'm going to talk about Clint Brooks. I'm going to talk about some specific examples I think that are important. So I'll pick this up in the next video.